Thank you very much for coming. If you can take your seat. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lynn Garofalo, Professor of Dance at Barnard College, the author of many classic books on the history of dance, and also the curator of exhibitions on Jerome Robbins and New York City Ballet. Please join me in welcoming Professor Garofalo.
Thank you. Wait. I was going to be over there, but I think I'd better be over here. I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this and to share some of these thoughts about the ballerina with about beauty in the ballerina with this audience. Beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, but it changes over time. And it means different things across the vast range of human culture. The same can be said of the ballerina, an icon of desire and a fetish of femininity. She exists in multiple forms, and like fashion, which she often exemplifies but also eludes, she keeps changing. Although people have always danced, ballet is a relatively young art. Its origins lie in the courts of Renaissance Italy and in the France of Louis XIV, where the practice acquired both a name and a nomenclature. The ballerina, however, was slower to emerge. Only in the 18th century did she claim the spotlight, and it took another 100 years for her to acquire the point shoes and tutu that became the distinctive badges of her identity. I'm just having a little question about, sorry, we're having a little technical moment. I just want to know which one is it this one over here that I pressed to move forward? Yes, it is. Okay. It wasn't a big technical snafu. Of course, we glimpse qualities associated with the ballerina long before that iconic moment. Nefertiti's swan-like neck and proud carriage of the head, exemplified by this sculpture from ancient Egypt. The plunging backbend of this dancing Maenad from Paestum. The three graces, the lightness, harmony, and youth of the three graces in Botticelli's painting La Primavera. The gestural vividness and physical boldness of Filippo Lippi's red-slippered Salome, sorry, I have two computers here and I'm using paper. Filippo Lippi's red-slippered Salome dancing for Herod in exchange for the head of John the Baptist. I love these Renaissance dancers. True, they were the made-up images of painters conjured from the imagination, not pictures of real people dancing. But they were always moving, tripping lightly, unburdened by layers of clothing and social convention. In the dance treatises of the Renaissance, by contrast, the images of real dancing women were rigid and static, encased in farthingales and iron corsets, with sleeves to the hands and ruffs to the chin. These high-born ladies were prisoners of fashion. Here from Fabrizio Caroso's late 16th century treatise Il Ballarino are a few of his marchesas and principessas performing a stately pavane or the sedate stepping dance known as the bassa, every last one of them dressed to kill. No wonder the painters favored diaphanous fabrics and looped up overskirts, imagining the moving body beneath the layers of Renaissance clothing. No wonder, too, that engravers preferred women who stepped lively and displayed a bit of attitude. With all that court stuff, who could move? Could any of those principessas even sense their own bodies? An early ballerina to seize the public imagination was the Paris opera star Marie Camargo. Born in 1710, she shortened her skirts to a few inches above the ankle. She may or she may not have been the first, the better to display the sparkle of her petit allegro. Conservatives were incensed at the sight of so much flesh. The fact that she lived openly as the mistress of the Comte de Clermont only added fuel to the fire. But ankles weren't all she bared. Her plunging décolletage displayed her neck and shoulders with much of her bosom. Her ballerina rival, Marie Salé, who was also a choreographer, was equally daring. She tossed off the mask that dancers had worn for over a century and donned body-skimming dresses that celebrated the sensuousness of her figure. A chanson of the time referred to her arms as amiable seducers. Jean-Georges Noverre, the choreographer whose theories of the new action ballet were partly inspired by her, much preferred what he called her nobility and harmonious simplicity and her tender, voluptuous, but always modest movements to Camargo's technical brilliance. He obviously responded to her expressiveness, her ability to quicken the heart and speak to the soul. Like Camargo, albeit in a very different way, she was unique. Now, ballerinas may have taken center stage, but they often had to share it with men such as Gaëtan Vestris, who once declared, "There are only 3 men in Europe, the King of Prussia, Monsieur de Voltaire, and me." Obviously, he did not have a problem of self-esteem. This changed dramatically with the advent of Romanticism. The movement swept full-blown onto the stage of the Paris Opera in 1832 with the premiere of La Sylphide. The ballet starred Marie Taglioni, the prototypical romantic ballerina, and introduced the ballet blanc, or the so-called white ballet. Both were radically new, a vision of enchanted sisterhood and ethereal femininity. In the ballet blanc, the hero glimpsed his unattainable love among white or pastel-skirted willies, naiads, sylphs, naiads, and other mysterious creatures. Now, this, by the way, is Carlotta Grisi, the first Giselle. Now, Taglioni was not the first ballerina to dance on point. However, it was only in La Sylphide that this relatively new technique acquired a metaphysical dimension and became uniquely an expression of the eternal feminine. When a dancer rises on her points, the Russian émigré critic Andrei Levinson wrote in the 1920s, she breaks away from the exigencies of everyday life and enters into an enchanted country, that she may thereby lose herself in the ideal. Sorry. One glimpses that enchanted country in lithographs of the era. Romantic prints varied in subject matter, but they belonged above all to the ballerina. Often she was shown in flight, eluding the arms of a lover. Or she might stand demurely on a scallop shell, tantalizing in her nearness. Or she could be swimming. She was a creature of the air and a daughter of nature, who made her home in secluded valleys, misty lakesides, secret glades, and wild heaths. If you know La Sylphide or Giselle, it's all there. The Romantic era dramatically transformed the relationship of ballet and gender. With her pointe shoes and tutu, the ballerina became a kind of Freudian fetish, while ballet itself became increasingly an art identified with the feminine. Not only did women dominate the romantic ballet in numbers, they also dominated its subject matter. For French critics such as Théophile Gautier, ballet was above all a display of femininity, an art glorifying beauty as embodied in the ballerina. If any woman is required to be beautiful, he wrote, it must surely be the dancer. He personally didn't care for what he called Taglioni's ethereal, virginal grace. He preferred, instead, the pagan charms, pagan is his word, of the Austrian ballerina Fanny Elsler, famed for her performance of Spanish dances. And this print is actually called The Three Graces, and as you see, that's Taglioni in the middle wearing a dress that is virtually identical to a dress, the real dress that's displayed downstairs in the show, which is very exciting. She recalls the muse terpsichore, Gautier wrote, with her tambourine and her tunic slit to reveal her thigh and caught up with clasps of gold, when she fearlessly arches back, throwing her voluptuous arms behind her, she evokes a vision of those beautiful figures from Herculaneum or Pompeii, or one might add even Paestum, like the one we saw before. For Gautier, nothing was more alien to the romantic ballet than real men. "You know what a hideous sight an ordinary male dancer is," he wrote. "A great awkward creature with a long red neck swelling with muscles, thick calves, the airs of Adonis and Apollo, and the pirouette and other gestures of mechanical puppets," end quote. He much preferred travesty dancers, women who donned the garb of princes, sailors, soldiers or lovers, and made men increasingly redundant, turning the stage into an all-female seraglio. The Romantic era tutu ended at mid-calf. As the 19th century wore on, it grew shorter and puffier, adding the layers of tulle that became a fire hazard on the crowded gaslit stages of the 1860s and 1870s. And if any of you have ever done a little bit of newspaper research during that period, it's astonishing the number of stories about ballet girls and fire. And we laugh, but I wouldn't have wanted to be one of those ballet girls on fire. New ballerinas came to the fore, famed for their strength, precision, and bravura. They were both Victorian fantasy objects and virtuoso machines. They had sturdy legs and well-fleshed bodies with ever-expanding skirts over safely hidden hips and buttocks. Here, flanking Claudina Cucchi as Giselle in the middle is Carlotta Brianza on the left, who is the first Aurora in The Sleeping Beauty, and on the right, Pierina Legnani, Petipa's first Odette Odile in Swan Lake. In Degas' paintings, the ballerina seems to emerge from a halo of tulle, her own and those of her sister dancers, the outline of her limbs visible through the diaphanous fabric. By the century's end, she had acquired the hourglass figure of an Edwardian temptress, hips flaring from a wasp waist and an ample bosom, exemplified by Virginia Zucchi in this painting by Georges Clairin. In February 1895, Figaro Illustré published a special issue about the Paris Opera. More than half the issue was given over to the opera's dancers. Black and white photographs showed children in class. Now, notice the lower photograph with the boys' class, there were all of 4 boys in the school. Obviously, male dancing was not valued in the 1890s in Paris. Color photographs, meanwhile, showcased the company's stars and rising talents in their dressing rooms or stretching in the foyer de danse, both off limits to the general public, though not to the opera's annual subscribers. There are mimes with sultry good looks and travesty dancers with a touch of attitude. But the core, even in an exotic divertisement such as this one for the opera Samson and Delilah, celebrated a collective image of girlishness. Sexual allure and sophisticated beauty were the province of the ballerina. The 20th century transformed the ballerina just as it transformed women's bodies. Corsets were abandoned, leaving the torso free to bend, stretch, and arch. Dancers associated with the modern movement, led by Isadora Duncan, donned tunics that invited accusations of nakedness and threw away their shoes. Here are a few of Abraham Wolkowitz's many watercolors of Duncan dancing. In Michel Fokин's works for the Ballet Russe, there was barely a tutu to be seen. He too dressed his ballerinas in tunics, while his choreography celebrated the curving line and dynamic energy, the dynamic energy that Leon Bakst revealed in his costume designs, and two of them are here. Fokин's dancers reveled in their newfound freedom. Tamara Karsavina and Anna Pavlova may not have been the greatest technicians of their day, but they were deeply expressive. The plasticity of their upper bodies told new stories and expanded three-dimensionally into space. Their feet touched the ground and they shared their dreams with their audiences. And I'd like to point out that Pavlova, who's on the upper right, is actually wearing a pleated Fortuny dress. She had many, as did Isadora Duncan. And I would have loved to have seen one down in the exhibition. I was so hoping there'd be one. However, they never abandoned the tutu or point work. However, they infused them with the vague, elusive sensuousness prized by symbolists. Even as Giselle or The Dying Swan, the solo that Pavlova danced for audiences around the globe for nearly 20 years, they were modern ballerinas. Of course, the tutu didn't disappear. When it returned in the late 1920s, however, it looked decidedly modern, with new materials and skirts that revealed most of the leg. In La Chatte, Olga Svesitsova wore a tutu of semi-transparent mica, then a very new material. In The Prodigal Son, which is in the middle, Felia Dubrovska wore a skirt that barely covered her upper thighs. Her siren descendants at the New York City Ballet wear pretty much the same costume today. Alice Nikitina, as Flora, in a pseudo-mythological ballet, barely wore a skirt at all. It was only a short step to leotards, and in Ode, a 1928 ballet choreographed by Leonid Massine, the Balanchine look was born. In fact, in the 1930s, Massine was about the only choreographer in either ballet or modern dance who put his dancers, men as well as women, into leotards. Here, for instance, is Jeu d'Enfant. This is the one on the right. Standing up is the top, alias Tamara Tumanova, and that was in 1932. On the left is Rouge et Noir from 1938, with Alicia Markova as the woman in a leotard, it said, painted by Matisse himself. How bodies had changed since the days of those sturdy Victorian primas. The 1920s and 1930s weren't only about ballerina legs or even about classical divas. The allure of a woman dancing alone was just as evident in the great Spanish dancer Antonia Merced, who called herself La Argentina, who donned the serpentine bata de cola of the flamenco dancer. Felia Dubrovska in the long Russian jumper dress known as the sarafan that she wore as the bride in Les Noces. Nina Verchinina, a ballet dancer who had studied with Mary Wigman, in the trouser dress that dramatized the expansiveness of her gestures in Les Présages, or Martha Graham, who invented and even stitched her own costumes, as we've already heard, wearing the knitted jersey tubes that stretched like a second skin in satiric song and her signature solo, Lamentation. Or Sono Osato, the glamorous Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo dancer, who was the first Miss Turnstiles in On the Town. All these women cast a spell of personality and imagination. In 1948, after several failed companies, George Balanchine and Lincoln Kirstein teamed up yet again to form, this time, the New York City Ballet. From the first, the new company struggled to define itself graphically. How was it different from the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, with which Balanchine had only recently been affiliated? What made it distinctive? The answer became apparent in the covers of the souvenir programs of the 1950s. The New York City Ballet was not about costume or scenery or painters, even though they were all in evidence during the company's early seasons. It was about feet and legs, unadorned and unapologetically balletic. In ultra-modern ballets such as Agon and the Four Temperaments, it was also about sleek black leotards, neatly belted at the waist, worn with the cool of a runway model and the energy of an athlete. Now, I should explain, this photo is of Concerto Barocco. They're not in leotards, they're in another kind, sort of very short tunics, another kind of practice wear. And the interesting thing is that it is very dark and they were only shifted to white, which is what is now used in the 1960s. In large numbers, these B-girls, as Stravinsky called them, could seem anonymous. But as individuals, Balanchine's women exuded strong personalities. Maria Tallchief, vulnerable and proud. Tanaki Leclerc, with legs as witty as they were long. Allegra Kent, a flower child married to the Vogue photographer Bert Stern, who sometimes used her as a model for the magazine, and that's where I found these photographs. Kent, too, had limbs that went on forever, and a flexibility that made the most extreme positions seem natural. By the standards of the time, the Balanchine ballerina was thin. Hers was an active working body, powerful rather than decorative. Muscle gave it shape, but shape was going out of style. With the arrival of Twiggy in the mid-1960s, fashion said goodbye to curves. Ballet dancers followed suit. They became leaner and even longer and acquired the look of sophisticated nymphets. Quote, Balanchine amid his new breed, is how Newsweek captioned this photo in 1969. And if you look closely, you can see Gelsey Kirkland on the extreme right, and then 3 in is a very, very young Merrill Ashley. And there are many others there who some of you would know. But a strong gale wasn't about to snap these dancers in two, as a fashion writer wrote about Twiggy's distinctive look. Like Merrill Ashley, by the 1970s, they were leading their art to new heights. When Suzanne Farrell returned to the New York City Ballet in the mid-1970s, she brought a European glamour with her, a sophisticated womanly presence. The decade marked the height of the dance boom, a golden age for ballerinas. Jet travel whisked them around the world, and everyone seemed to converge on New York. At ABT, there was Natalia Makarova, she's on the lower left, who defected from the Kirov Ballet in 1970, along with homegrown stars such as Cynthia Gregory, who's shown in her Black Swan costume, and Gelsey Kirkland. At Ailey, there was Judith Jameson, the choreographer's muse, and Sarah Yarborough, who had grown up in Haiti and trained at the School of American Ballet. Like many dancers of the 1970s, Jameson was tall, with legs that carved huge arcs through space, plangent and powerful. The ballerina, like the proverbial zebra, keeps changing her stripes. She belongs to her moment. Now that gyms have replaced dance studios as preferred recreational sites, she looks more than ever like an athlete, her body toned by years of cross-training, in addition to a growing number of hours spent in the studio. But she brings more to the stage than mere athletic prowess. In this 1996 photograph of Wendy Whalen with Peter Bohl in Opus 19, one senses the imaginative power that lies behind her simplest gesture, even as her muscled legs and turnout speak of technical mastery. This is the ballerina's secret, her ability to lead us into the secret chambers of her art, disclosing its beauty through physical action, lit by her imagination, and filtered through her own subjectivity. Thank you. Not one question, not one remark.
I have a remark, something that struck me very interesting. The photograph you showed in the 19th century when you mentioned that costumes caught on fire. I noticed the two ballerinas, the two dancers on the far left and the far right, they were on their toes. And what came to my mind was that at that period, what was the time of exposure of a photograph?
It wasn't an action photograph.
Yeah, so they were probably propped up on some kind of
They were resting against something because I think the time exposure at that point was like a minute. And
Yeah.
even though they had fabulous balance, remember one of them did the first Rosadagio, nevertheless, that's pushing it. And they had to send it. So very often things would then be, one might say, airbrushed out.
So in other words, the photographs of that period they're not like slices of time
No.
of within dance, whereas in the 20th century, although in the 20th century oftentimes they posed, but still they were like slices of time. You could capture the dancers in movement.
It depends when. The earliest sort of action photographs that I know which captured movement are some of Nijinsky from about 1910, where he's shown jumping, or maybe 1909. But that was a real rarity. It's not really until the 1920s that you see performance photographs, that you see photographs where people are taken while dancers are obviously moving.
Hello? Oh, hi, here. Ms. Garafola?
Yes?
Hi, I'm on the side.
Okay.
Do you think the image of the classical ballerina with the tutu and the tiara is fading away, or is going to start fading away?
Well, I think there are many competing images and I think it also depends how much one knows about the field, where one is in the field, et cetera, et cetera. For instance, if one is working in a ballet company, obviously that's only part of the story. But consider, for little girls, consider that whole series of children's books, Angelina Ballerina. Consider all the stuff that is sold to girls, tutus and various other things. This remains an image that we have to deal with. Also consider, even at the New York City Ballet, which is a true repertory company, as we heard this morning, this is absolutely true, they spend at least 6 weeks every year doing at least one, if not two, performances a day of Nutcracker, whose culminating female image is the Sugar Plum Fairy in her tutu. So I think the tutu is something that remains even in a repertory company. As a historian, I probably spend a great deal more time talking about Balanchine's leotard ballets, to use that term, which is not entirely correct, than I do about all the ballets, one can say, in which he used tutus, and which were performed in tutus. So I think it's not the only image, but I think it's a very crucial one, and it's one that has certainly held its own despite all the other contending images.
Thank you.
Hi, I want to know, I realize that Balanchine is responsible for the long limbs, but had that trend started before he really said this is how he wants his dancers to look?
Absolutely. It really starts, I think, in the 1920s, when the dancers begin to slim down. As you saw, I had a slide of 3 dancers. I said when the tutu comes back in the 20s, it looks more modern. Diaghilev would not put someone in a dress like that unless he felt that they had almost more like a flapper look. In other words, longer, slimmer legs and could show their legs. He only liked to see certain types of legs. But remember, this is where Balanchine does his earliest ballets. And so I think this is something that certainly predates the New York City Ballet, but it's certainly something that is allied, I would say, with fashion and with changes in what was considered the fashionable body. The two leotard dancers in leotards from the 1930s, the Massine, this predates the New York City Ballet from the 1930s, and as you see, the body is already, those bodies are quite different from those of the stockier ballerinas. So I think there's always, as I said, there's a real connection between fashion and the ballerina, but that sometimes the ballerina eludes fashion. Sometimes she exemplifies it, or exemplifies changes that are taking place. I think one of the interesting things we heard this morning from Wendy Whalen is, how different she felt her body and the bodies of her fellow dancers were from the mannequins, from models, that they were not runway bodies. And speaking about the musculature and everything else, and what they're, apart from the fact that the body needs to move and therefore the clothes have to be different and they have to have all their little secret things. But the ballerina herself does exemplify something, but also eludes it, I think.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
First, thank you very much. It was incredibly informative talk. You mentioned in the beginning about the male dancer, but only briefly. Do you think there is an evolution in the male image and the male dancer in the modern ballet, even comparing the New York City Ballet and ABT? And ABT, we have such a vast amplitude between Marcelo Gomez and Daniil Simkin, and New York City Ballet, where it's just the evolution of a male image and of the image of a male dancer through the costume. Can you a little touch up on that?
That's a whole other lecture, and I spent a great deal of time trying not to put men into this, and I didn't entirely succeed. Ailey's in there and a few others. There were, of course, enormous revolutions in the male thing, in the presentation of the male, especially in the early 20th century. Dramatic. Remember, the ballet stage of the 19th century was hugely feminized, was largely populated by women, and in the early 20th century, there's the first of a really major gender shift with the Ballet Russe, with figures such as Nijinsky, such as Massines, Adolphe Bohm, wonderful and diverse male images, and that continues into the, continues. There are different Soviet styles of dancing. There are many different things. But as I say, that's really a whole different image. This was about, for once, I wanted to talk about women.
Thank you very much.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about race in ballet and the role of African American ballerinas.
Unfortunately, African American ballerinas have not had a tremendously active role in the history of ballet. There is a pervasive racism throughout the field. I'm not certain that I would say this is intended racism, but sometimes you can have unintended consequences for any number of reasons, and that's something. I'm delighted that the Dance Theater of Harlem is beginning again, because it gives, I believe, a goal to young girls that perhaps who may, instead of shifting over to study obsessively other forms during those crucial years of training, that they would then, actually still study obsessively ballet. So I just hope that Virginia Johnson will find the funding and the dancers to continue her project, because I feel it's enormously important. But it's also absolutely essential for any of us who have any connection with any organization to point out, in whatever ways we can, that there are ways of finding African American dancers. There are ways of finding and identifying African American critics. There are ways of identifying and finding African Americans who can be part of the ballet world. Yes.
I was delighted to see the photographs of Figaro, of the Paris Opera Ballet. I have a similar spread from 1990 with the ballerinas of the time, and that made me wonder if ballerinas were an actual inspiration for designers in Paris or in any other fashion center. Do you have any examples, or do you know of any? Of a ballerina being amused to fashion design?
Being amused to fashion designers. I would have to think about that, because right now that was not the project I set myself to do. Certainly in the 19th century, I think they worked more closely with people who did their distinctive wardrobes, as did many actresses. They didn't actually have the designer per se doesn't really enter the dance world until really the 20th century. I would say that Bakst, for instance, was inspired for some of his designs, his streetwear, by not so much by certain people who were not quite dancers, but more like the Marchesa Casati, and who were divas of some kind and exceptional personalities. I'm kind of running through my Rolodex of Diaghilev dancers, and I can't really think. The one who was the real inspiration was not a ballerina at all, but really Nijinsky. And I'm not so sure how much that was connected. He inspired fashion, although many of the illustrators who depicted him visually were connected with the fashion world in some way, such as Georges Barbier and others. But I'm not really quite, I'm not really, well, I wouldn't call her a ballerina, but nevertheless, Rubinstein, although Rubinstein was usually not dressed by Bakst, even though she was dressed by him on stage for some of the time, and then in the 20s, she often had her clothes made up by one of the Paris houses. I'm sorry? Yeah, but I thought we were talking about the other way, about a designer being inspired by a dancer, and that would be the sort of other way. Of course, I think there may have been connections with certain designers like Fortuny, but I think it was really more like Pavlova, who was a very fashion, became something of a fashion icon, as well as, I would say, Isadora Duncan, who had a lot of these Fortuny dresses. But I think there might have been some kind of thing, but, I don't really know. Margot Fontaine had a very close relationship with Dior and then Saint Laurent. So there might have been something there.
One last question.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, my question is sort of along this line, because we know that life imitates art and vice versa. So I was going to ask a fashion question in regard to this. Was dancing on point related to high-heeled shoes, for example, or was it inspired by it? Did it coincide with it? Was there some sort of interrelationship there, do you think?
I actually don't think there was. I think there was more of a relationship, the early development of point work. In fact, the early development of point work depended on being able to get flat on your foot. In the 18th century, as you can see in one of the Camargo thing I showed, she's actually dancing on heels. And throughout the 18th century, the ballerinas danced in low heels, and it was only around the time of the French Revolution that they began adopting these kind of Grecian tunics again, which had become fashionable in society. I think of some of those, the dresses, Madame Recamier and others, and began wearing on stage for dancing at least some kind of sandals. And that meant that you could actually have your whole foot, and then you would stretch your foot. It enabled you to do a whole lot more. So what you do see in the 1830s there are shoes, the first point shoes, which are in fact like fashionable slippers, but then they were darned. The ones we saw, I'm pretty sure, were used for national dances or character dances. They would be then darned with this very thickly to strengthen the sides of the foot and then across the toe, so that they're with very strong feet, and which came about through the development of the technical development of certain kinds of exercises to strengthen the feet. You could actually go up momentarily on point. And it wasn't until they began putting blocks into something to stiffen the end of the toe, and then also to really stiffen the sole, that you could start doing a whole number of other exercises. But that doesn't happen until after the 1860s. Okay.
While Tanya works on the computer, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Adelaide Rasche is curator of the famous Lipperheide collection in Berlin, and she's curated and written extensively on fashion, and she's sitting on not only one of the world's greatest fashion image collections, but also one of the world's greatest dance image collections. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Heidi Rasche.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody. I also have to get used to work with 2 computers and paper. So I feel more than honored to have the occasion to speak to you today, and I would like to express my deepest thanks to Valerie for including my contribution into this wonderful symposium. When we met last November in Berlin, I could briefly show some objects of the collection. There is some problem with the noise. I'm hearing myself twice. So I could show her some objects of the collection I'm in charge of, to Valerie and to Mary Davis. We were looking at early dance theory books, at vintage photographs with German modern dancers from the 1920s, at the French portfolio Sport et Divertissement from 1922 with music by Eric Satie and illustrations from Charles Martin. And I think we spent a great time at these iconic works of art related to dance. As most of you will not know the Lipperheide Costume Library, I would like to introduce briefly this unique museum's collection to you. And one additional mark before continuing: as my mother language is German, I'm apologizing for all mistakes and wrong expressions which I might use and which might make it difficult for you to follow my talk. The Lipperheide Costume Library has its foundings in the private collection of Franz von Lipperheide, a Berlin-based editor of fashion magazines in the late 19th century. The commercial success of Lipperheide can best be compared to Jörg Condé Nast. His magazine, Die Modenwelt, the fashion world, was published worldwide and in more than 15 languages during the last decades of the 19th century. His private collection was focusing on written and pictorial sources concerning all aspects of dress and fashion history. Covering all periods and continents, our collection comprises today about 20,000 volumes of magazines, 20,000 monographs dating from the 16th to the 21st century, approximately 150,000 single images, prints, drawings, and photographs, and some 900 paintings. Subjects like theater and dance, ethnic and occupational costume, travels and sports, caricature, uniforms, dress code, fashion, accessories, and beauty are covered. The range of subjects is incredibly wide, and the holdings very rich in terms of age and internationality. I regularly do special exhibitions and publications based on our own collections. I've listed some of them on this page. This autumn, we are displaying fashion images from the period of World War I. I've brought a display copy of the book with me. It's entitled Wardrobes in Wartime, and it's an English edition. If you're interested to have a look, please join me after the presentation. For today, I'd like to concentrate on some aspects of the Berlin dance scene during the Weimar Republic. All images which you will see on the screen have been selected from our own collections. During the 1920s, fashion and dance were probably the most emphatically interrelated manifestations of the zeitgeist, which marked the pulsating metropolis of Berlin, then the world's third largest city after New York and London. Until 1933, Berlin was a booming center of fashion with huge output figures in all categories, from inexpensive stapleware to the high-demand middle market segment and to exclusive one-off creations by fashion designers who offered original models both of their own collections and from Paris fashion houses. Fashion made in Berlin became an export hit throughout Europe and North America and enjoyed great popularity because it provided a good fit and what they called a wearable chic. The consumption of fashion was just as much part of everyday life of the pleasure-seeking population as the highly diversified leisure culture. Berliners eagerly responded to every novelty in dance, be it a ballet premiere at the Opera House, a new dance orchestra at the Grand Hotel Adlon, a guest performance by Josephine Baker, or the competing revues. Just to give you an example of the impact of dance in the media, I was going through the winter issues from 1926 of the Berlin lifestyle magazine Elegante Welt, the Elegant World. They published illustrated articles about the newest dance halls in Berlin and Paris, about Maddie Christians, a diva of silent film, in dancewear from a well-known Berlin fashion house. Furthermore, they wrote about Berlin-based dance bands and their jazz music. They printed a story by Walter Becker with the promising title, Dance and Love. They discussed at length the then new Berlin musical revue extravaganza, The Night of the Nights by Robert Nelson, which unfolded, quote, in the unrestrained, breathtaking rhythm of New York's Broadway, end quote. And finally, they explained the most recent dance fad, the Charleston. In 1918, the German dance critic Alfons Törek noted two simple but very true phrases, quote, music, body, costume. These three terms seem to delineate the domain of any form of dance. Everything related in some way or another to dance resides within this conceptual triad, music, body, costume, end quote. A great variety of styles was developed in the immediate post-war years. Classical ballet, rhythmic gymnastics in the manner of Rudolf von Laban and Emil Jacques-Dalcroze, modern stage dance, dance revues with groups of showgirls, and finally the various ballroom dances as cultivated at traditional balls and in modern dance clubs. In my talk, I'd like to focus on three of these dance forms. First, on modern stage dance, and in the second part, on ballroom dances and dance revues. The modern dance movement, in German called Ausdruckstanz, so expressive dance, was marked by many individual dancers. Today I'd like to introduce two very diverse dancers to you, Valeska Gert and Mary Wigman. In August 1926, the famous grotesque dancer Valeska Gert presented her new dance parody entitled Charleston, which she had created in direct response to the ballroom dance that, starting that year, was the hottest trend in dance imported from the United States. in her usually exaggerated, expressionist style, the then 34-year-old dancer interpreted a topical theme, confronting viewers with a caricature of their own existence and of their own personal addiction to pleasure. Gert's stage costume consisted of a transparent top with her breasts clearly showing through, a bright collar, old-fashioned oversized pants, trimmed with lace and heeled bar shoes that were also commonly worn in day-to-day life. The combination of colors hasn't come down to us, but probably there were sharply contrasting colors, which were a hallmark of her dance costumes. By foregoing any outerwear, the dancer very obviously evoked the erotic allure of the parodied dance. At the same time, she skillfully played on the stereotypes of the typical fashion of the time, which had to confront accusations that the evening wear often looked like underwear. In her visual interpretation of the Charleston, Gert exaggerated the fashion conventions of her day and at the same time created a caricature of the decadent bourgeois society. From the beginning of her career, Valeska Gert was well aware of the tremendous importance of her stage costumes. Already at an early stage, she had experienced the intoxicating effect of clothes, as evidenced by this anecdote from before 1914. Quote, "One day I put on a red chiffon dress and danced alone in a dark room. While spinning around, I felt this rush coming over me that ever since I've been seeking again and again." Soon she was known for her eccentric costumes with bold color combinations. Another quote from her memories. "One evening prior to the dance show, I invented out of my body puffy orange pantaloons that ended above the knees. I wrapped my upper body tightly. I painted my face in a chalky white, my eyes in bright yellow, and tied a vibrant blue ribbon around my neck and my feet. Shortly afterwards, I performed for the first time in high-heeled shoes. For the first time, I brought bold, pure colors and bold and simple forms on the stage." End quote. Alongside her brilliant career as a dancer, Valeska Gert also wrote a number of texts on fashion that have until now received scant attention. Some quotes of these texts are included in my text contribution to the book Dance and Fashion, which you will find outside afterwards, edited by Valerie Steele. For her fast-paced dances, Valeska Gert herself, rather than wearing extravagant models of renowned fashion designers, always dressed in self-designed costumes that were suitable for the stage and included fashionable and eroticizing elements such as flounces, little hats, and short, swinging skirts. Let us now see what can be said on the wardrobe of the famous dancer Mary Wigman. Wigman, whose solo dances were consummate individual performances with strong themes and convincing physical expression, had a large fan following in Germany and when doing guest performances in the United States. Her dance style was emblematic of German dance in its cultural form. Wigman usually designed her own stage costumes and had them manufactured by others. Thank you. Wigman usually designed her own stage costumes and had them manufactured by others. References, could you please stop this? I think it's not part of the afternoon, thank you. References to contemporary fashion played a minor role in her designs, as the garments mainly had to serve the motion and the expression of her moods and thoughts, as well as translate the essence of what she called her soul dance into an external form. Clearly, Wigman was less interested in a fashionable design than in ways to manifest through her stage costume the spatial gestalt of a particular dance. She was particularly attached to her brocade costume from Hexentanz 2, which is Witch Dance 2, and you see it on the screen. A large cloth seamed up on the sides and fastened at the neck and waist. She found this costume years later when cleaning up a closet and instantly remembered how she had bought the fabric. I quote her, "I see myself again standing in the House of Fabrics in Switzerland and being fascinated by the splendor spread out before my eyes. Blazing over the coppery silver ground were boldly dashed metallic ornaments, glistening in gold and silver with black lines piercing through, tantalizing, wild, barbaric. I was as if hypnotized and bought the cloth against my will, for it cost a small fortune, and I knew that I would not have any use for it. All I had was a guilty conscience, and so the showpiece ended up in the fabric drawer of my wardrobe, where for years it remained hidden even from my own view." End quote. It was only when she started working on the witch dance in 1926 that the brocade fabric found its purpose. I continue the quote, "Suddenly it struck me, the brocade cloth, did it not have something about it in its barbaric beauty, its flaunty recklessness that corresponded to the rebellious character of the dance? And then there was the first and never used mask of the ceremonial figure, whose featured wear interpreted demonically mine. Suddenly I knew that the cloth and the mask belonged together, and that they had to wait so long to be taken out of their exile only in order for the witch dance to have its characteristic stage form in terms of costume and mask as well." The surviving black and white photographs, which you see here, convey the stage effect of the patterned garment and the demonic mask in an expressive manner, even if the combination of red and gold surely added decisively to the overall impression. To conclude this first part, and I'm showing pictures without going in detail, it's again Mary Wickman on the far left. Then this is, and her group, this is Margarete Wallmann, and these are Harald Kreuzberg dances with Yvonne Georgi as his partner. So to conclude this first part, we can say that the protagonists of new German dance of the 1920s considered the individual dance costume an important vehicle of expression. In modern dance, the dance dress functioned as an aesthetic element of corporality, allowing for the expansion of the body in movement, and it was employed as a means of expression and content. Of paramount importance for harmonious unity of cloth and body was the dancer's sense of self. In general, not much is known about the specific relationship of dancers of this important dance movement to their stage outfits. Who conceived and designed the different costumes? Who manufactured them? The dancers themselves left very few specific statements on the matter, and in the literature too, one mostly finds just descriptions. One exception is a chapter in a book entitled Body and Garment. A chapter is entitled Body and Garment, and the book is entitled Der moderne Tanz, The Modern Dance by Ernst Schur, which was published as early as 1910. In Schur's view, the dance costume is essential for stage dance. Only with the stage costume, he says, this stage costume lends the dancing body the appropriate expressiveness. Arguing for a disciplined approach to fashionable tastes, Schur prefers the timeless garment, which is reflected in the many surviving photographs. As we have seen, the dance costumes of the modern dancers of this period were fundamentally different from all other dance forms, dance costumes that were common at the time. I'm showing the other forms with one example each. The classic ballet costume reshapes the body in a stylized way through tutu and pointu on the left. The mask costume, as in the spectacular Bauhaus dances and in Oskar Schlemmer's triadic ballet, negates the body and superimposes artificial structures on it. The leotard and the similar training garments emphasize the athletic aspect of dance and the exotic dance as seen in many performances of the Ballet Russe. I don't have a slide for this. It transforms the dancer's body into a historical or folkloristic image. And finally, the fashionable dancewear of the revue theater and ballroom dancing, it serves to display the erotic body. So in the second part of my presentation, I would like to show what look and which qualities fashionable dancewear for social dance was supposed to have in the 1920s. I will focus on images from Berlin, but we should keep in mind that the same is true for Paris or for the US. The usually quite close-fitting bustier top typically had a sleeveless design. Conforming to the fast-moving ballroom dances, the skirts became relatively short around the mid-1920s. They were now preferably flared, sometimes with a design consisting of several panels and ending in tails or flounces. Tulle was described as a preferred material, quote, that already carries a certain lightness within itself, as it were, end quote. In addition, other lightweight silks were used, such as crêpe georgette, crêpe satin, velours transparent, velours brocade, velours soleil, and last but not least, the fashion-resisting crêpe de Chine. Both quotes with the fabrics are from an article in the illustrated magazine Der Tanz, The Dance, from 1926. Artificial silks became increasingly popular. Black lace dresses over silver or gold lame undergarments were also recommended. Well-fitting gold or silver-colored or high-gloss bar shoes of fine chevreau leather were indispensable. Aside from the countless dance bars, clubs, and balls, another mass phenomenon shaped the entertainment repertoire that Berlin offered in the 1920s. I'm referring to the American-style musical revue extravaganza that included large dance numbers. Particularly appealing about them was the constantly changing sets, as well as the richly varied costumes, some of which were bought in Paris or New York, though most of them were designed by German costume or fashion designers. The stage wear of the female protagonist tended to be very close to the fashion of the day. Her costumes could indeed match the quality of haute couture clothes and were often executed by fashion houses. Thus, the successful Berlin fashion designer Johanna Marbach was reportedly hired in 1926 to design and manufacture the women's costume for a revue entitled An und Aus, which means on and off, a reference to the constant changes in women's clothes during those years, as well as to the changes prescribed for different parts of the day. The article in the Elegante Welt, which you see here on the slide, underscored the resplendence and richness of the costumes. Quote, those ruffled, pleated, and draped flowing robes made of brightly colored silk velvet, whose effect has been immensely enhanced by iridescent bead embroideries, end quote. The actress Alice Hetchy, shown on the right, wears an oriental model made of brocade with a culotte skirt. Composed by Walter Kollo, the revue An and Aus included 58 changes of scenery and appearances of stars. Stars mostly engaged from abroad, and as well large dance numbers featuring several groups of showgirls whose costumes were designed by Ludwig Kainer, a multi-talented painter, fashion designer, and stage artist. Highly erotic in design, the showgirl costumes referenced both the latest fashion trends and historical costumes in a combination that was pushed to the extreme. Skirts and tops that were as skimpy as possible, as much rhinestones and glitter as possible, most unusual color combinations and appliques that were as large as possible. More than 400 performances of An and Aus at the Berlin Admiralspalast, which seated 3,000 plus viewers, testified to the success and influence of such revues. We have to keep in mind that the consumer society of the Weimar Republic was mainly formed by the young, middle and upper middle classes, likewise men and women. After the working days, they enjoyed free time with other independent young people. They frequented bars and theaters and discovered various forms of amusement. The new physical culture of the 1920s was predicated on terms such as agility, litheness, grace, and a slender figure, which people tried to achieve through sports, gymnastics, a healthy diet, and through dance. I'd like to end with an indicative quote from a decidedly modern and contemporary view. The quote is taken from the journal Der Tanz, from an article entitled Dance and the Appearance of the Modern Woman, published in 1928. And you can follow it on the screen. Dance and physical culture have taken on a central role in the life of modern women, and as a result, women have become more agile and nimble. This is reflected in every manifestation of social, professional, and private life. The shift in shape brought about by dance and sports has led to increasing self-confidence. A woman who knows that she's cutting a good figure, who senses that she is drawing admiration, glances when gliding across the dance floor in the arms of her dance partner, gains a new sense of self. This realization has given rise to the cultivation of the type of tender and tall and slender dance-like women with a glamorous erotic aura. She's young and buoyant, much taller than our mothers were, for dancing keeps you young, and the most important at the end, and the demand for a long youth is no longer a luxury, it has become a necessity. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience.
Thank you for calling our attention to some of these amazing German expressionist dance costumes. I wonder, can you tell us anything about their possible influence on American modern dance? They did certainly come over, people like Mary Wigman, and dance in America, didn't they?
Yes, Mary Wigman was one of the dancers who came over. I think most of the others didn't have their tourneys here in the country, but there was a big exchange via the media. The media of the time have been, I would say, even more quicker than today and more intense. We know this also in the other sense that this magazine called Der Tanz, which existed for some 10, 15 years, reported immediately upon every novelty here from the States and vice versa. So there was a big exchange, and I'm sure that when I see images of Mary Wigman, I also can't refrain from thinking of your big Martha Graham. Thank you, I just had a... There was certainly a great influence. Yes?
I'm familiar with Mary Wigman. I was wondering what her ethnicity was. Can you tell us about the demon mask? What is the origin of that and the material that it was made from?
Mm-hmm.
It looked kind of Asian.
I just go back to the slide. It's nicer to speak when you see it. So she had various dances with masks. She was collaborating with a mask maker in Germany. They were made of, wet paper, I would call it in German, and then it's paper mache. Okay, so we use the same word. and she was very famous for these dance masks. As she said, they were featured with her own on her own face, but then translated in a demonic version. And she also had other, we have great surviving pictures of other dance masks, also the mask alone without the face in it. It looks like a death mask sometimes. She had a great impact on students. She had a school. You have seen her on one of the slides also with her dance groups. And many of the second generation dancers came out of her school, which was in Dresden, completely bombed in the Second World War. But fortunately, she had some archives outside of her studio and her school. So the Berlin Academy of Arts has the estate of Mary Wigman, which is very rich in terms of unpublished material. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much for being here. I was fascinated. Mary Wigman, I did a little study of when I had to do a costuming project for a local community theater. And I wanted them to be very, very extra Martha Graham, Martha Graham, Martha Graham. So I did a little study, and it took me back to Mary Wigman. And if you Google Mary Wigman and you watch, and I watched it and over and over and over and over again, and then I watched Martha Graham, so that the dancers, the three dancers, I could evoke what they needed to do on stage at this little tiny theater. It is absolutely fascinating what she did, and that photograph that you showed of the mask with the garment, they showed the film last spring at the Museum of Modern Art when they did the big exhibit there, and that was the first time I'd ever seen Mary Wigman and had not known, even as a Graham trained dancer, I did not know about her. So I encourage everyone to Google Mary Wigman and look at some of the films, because it is fascinating when you see this
in movement,
captured in movement. And then you talk about the fabric. That was another thing that was so exciting, because I am a fabric librarian for my company. So thank you for bringing this fascinating aspect, which I did not expect today. It's just wonderful. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. When I was preparing and working on this text, I was really looking for quotes by dancers talking about the quality and the kind of costumes they wanted to use. And I was very astonished to find so little real quotes or memories. So I was so happy to find at least this one piece about this, about the witch dance, where she's talking about the importance of costume and masks. Initially I wanted also to include another section, and I will just very briefly show you the one image I've included in the PowerPoint, but I haven't prepared any text for this, as I think it would take me out of time. I do have various informations that Paul Poiret was in the 1920s working for various German dancers. And you have here, her name is not German, but she was working in Germany, as was Clotilde Derb. Maybe some of you know her name too, married to Alexander Sakharov. And so they had a close couple. Apparently, they are wearing dresses by Poiret, and I would really love to stay in this subject to know more about this collaboration. How did this work? Did they give them a sketch? Or say, I need something in these colors for I don't know, a Persian dance? Or did he? Or so I don't know if anybody is here who knows more about this part of Poiret and dance costumes in the 1920s. But I found this in the German Dance Archive, which is situated in Cologne, and is a great source. It's the best, let's say, collection in Germany that we have, also with moving images, which is so important for dance. Thank you for your mentioning the film of Wigman.
There is one little missing link in the Wigman legacy, which is her protege, Hanya Holm.
I didn't hear, sorry.
Her protege, Hanya Holm, who trained with her in Dresden,
Right.
was sent by Wigmann to the US to establish a school to teach her dance style here in New York in 1931. And Hanya Holm and Martha Graham were contemporaries, the big four. So I don't know, I just wanted to insert that into the
The name of
historical-
Hanya Holm shouldn't be omitted, you're right. But as I was talking about fashion and dance, I didn't really do a genealogy of modern dance from Germany to US. Thank you. Thank you again for your interest.
Well, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that there are copies of Dance and Fashion for sale outside in the lobby. The bad news is that they're only planning to stay till 4 o'clock to sell them. So I thought I would give you 7 minutes if you want to see the book or buy it, to go out and then come back to your seats in 7 minutes, and then we'll we'll have our next lecture, okay? So you have a slight break. You can take your seat. We're going to begin the next lecture. We've got 2 more lectures. Okay. If you can take your seats, that would be terrific. Thank you. And everyone should turn off their cell phones so we don't have any more strange ringtones going on. All right. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, my dear colleague and friend, Patricia Mears, Deputy Director of the Museum at FIT, and herself not only a ballet-main, but someone very experienced in personal life in ballet as well. So please join me in welcoming Patricia Mears.
Thank you, Valerie. Well, it's a thrill to be here and to speak on the subject of ballet. I must say it was kind of a highlight. I've always been watching Wendy Whalen, so to say that I've been on the same stage with her is really quite an honor. I'm really going to talk more about fashion today and bringing the subject of ballet into it, but really from a personal point of view. Like many of you, we took ballet lessons as children, and we probably saw images like this one of the wonderful Anna Pavlova. And I think since I was a child, I always made the assumption that ballet was not only a glamorous and wonderful art form, but one in which there was a certain amount of prestige associated with it. But certainly, as we heard Valerie and Lynn and others speak, there's always been a lot of marginal placement of the ballet dancer, often quite sadly so. But my images have always been of the wonderful interrelationship of the ballerina and her costume, the tutu. It's really probably the most emblematic thing one thinks of in this art form dominated by women. But that's not necessarily the case, and I hope to present a few musings on that concept. I think also many of us, rightly or wrongly, have always associated ballet with the glamour of fashion. Here we have a wonderful example again of Anna Pavlova from the 1920s, literally entwined with the swan. That very, very famous dance, The Dying Swan, was her emblematic work. But this idea also of the dancer and her slim body, and notice the very highly arched feet. This idea was certainly not the one that dominated dance when she was a young girl and coming up in the dance world. She was really anathema to this, and dancers like Tamara Karsavina wrote about how she needed feeding up because she was so skinny, and her sort of sickly body, although derided initially, became really the prototype of the modern dancer today. I think we take for granted the relationship between dance and fashion because this is the kind of thing that many people grow up seeing. We have Madonna from the 80s deconstructing and doing her postmodern take on the tutu. And certainly one of the most famous fashion, if you will, television programs, Sex and the City, starring Sarah Jessica Parker, herself a real dance fan with a great dancer's body. And here she is in a tutu, even a top that resembles a leotard and the vertiginously high heels, somewhat akin to a dancer's point shoes. But this interrelationship was not always so directly connected. As Lynn noted a little earlier, as did Valerie, Marie Taglioni was a very important figure in helping to advance ballet as a more legitimate and somewhat acceptable form of art for women. Taglioni did this in part through her dancing and her artistry, but also through the projection of the proper bourgeois woman. She did a lot to attract a wider female audience, a respectable audience, if you will, because she herself deported herself that way on stage. People noted how ladylike she was, and even in her personal life led the life she hoped would reflect that of the proper bourgeois French woman. She was so popular, in fact, that a number of manufacturers created styles. There was the Taglioni shawl, for example, that she received royalties on. But clearly her dance costume, as Valerie noted, was very, very different from what you would see in a respectable, even high fashion magazine. While the bodice and the shoes somewhat reflected high fashion, that diaphanous skirt certainly did not. And that's in fact where the term tutu comes from. Some people say it's related to the French term coucou, which itself is a sort of slang word for col, or the bottom, French bottom, because the people in the lower price seats, which is what we now call the orchestra seats, sometimes got a glimpse, a little more than they had bargained for, when the skirts would fly up. They were very, very diaphanous. And so it's unlikely that mid-19th century couturiers or women of power and prestige would ever have really desired to look like a ballerina, although certain images exist from that time period, and here are two wonderful ones from the 1860s, looking a little bit like a Swan Lake dress on the left, or something that you might see like coming out of Cotillon, but clearly these were not dance costumes in any way. And certainly dance in France, after the retirement of stars like Esler and Taglioni, really sort of decreased quite a lot. The quality of dancing and the quality of choreography and music that went with it diminished. Thankfully, we have the Russians to thank for reviving and really making ballet the great art form that it is. Sadly, it happened in some ways through their own revolution of 1917, but not before the ballet had really risen and become a supreme art form. And one of the ways in which we see this change is through the changing respect and wealth of some of its leading stars. This was the prima ballerina assoluta. I think her absolute supreme role as the leading ballerina in Russia can be questioned, but certainly not her role as a very powerful figure in the Mariinsky Theater, which was then the great epicenter of classical dance in the world. And what we see here is this woman who was the former mistress of Tsar Nicholas II is wearing some of her jewelry collection. She was very famous for having an incredible array of jewels, akin to someone in the royal family. And while people at top ranks, dancers in the Mariinsky, would be awarded jewelry from the imperial family, Shishinskaya's collection surpassed everyone's. She would not only wear them in real life, but also on stage. And it was said that she was so dazzling that she positively twinkled even when she was standing still. And here we have her arrayed in some of the Fabergé jewelry that she owned. Our colleague Anna Weinstein has written about the fact that when she went to London for one of her tours with Diaghilev, a big deal was made about this incredible jewelry that she traveled with and that she had to get special security guards, and I think they even did promotions with Selfridges department stores. And the role of the dancer and fashion, and in this case, extraordinary jewelry, I think was very important, again, for elevating the role and the importance of the ballerina at that time period. We see it in not only her physical manifestation, but also in what she was able to possess as an individual. Her incredible mansion in a beautiful section of St. Petersburg became, after the revolution, the headquarters for Lenin, after they pretty much destroyed the place. But the idea that a woman from a relatively modest background could rise to these ranks was something that was really not seen in Western Europe. But Russian ballet and the creation of dance costume and subsequently its impact on fashion was something that would take pretty much the 1870s through the early 20th century to establish. The vocabulary, the changes going back and forth would impact popular culture, ballet, as well as fashion. And one of the ways in which we see this transference of styles and the growth and development of ballet, the art form, is through the importation of foreign talent. The czars and the imperial family were very generous to people like Carlotta Brianza, one of the three great Italian ballerinas, Virginia Zucchi and Pierina Legnani, that Lynn mentioned earlier. And this Italian invasion, along with French and Scandinavian ballet masters, did a lot to reinvigorate dance. But Brianza was just one of several dancers who pushed to have higher skirts. Virginia Zucchi, also known as the Great Zucchi, actually started a bit of controversy in the 1880s when her role in La Fille du Ferraud required, on her part, a much higher body-revealing costume. And it so much shocked the Russians that they were going to shut the production down, but she insisted, I'm not going to wear a costume that would be fit for my grandmother. And the reason for this is the Italians were noted for being incredible athletes, and you can see this with these incredibly strong, sturdy bodies, not only reflecting the styles of the time, the more voluptuous Victorian and Edwardian bodies, but also the fact that it required that kind of physical exertion, because again, the shoes, as we've heard, were not as strong. And they also felt if they were going to go through all this effort to dance brilliantly, they wanted people to see their legs. By the early 20th century, we see great dancers like Vaganova, who would go on to become the most important dance teacher in Soviet Russia, adopting that ballet skirt, what would become the pancake tutu, higher, rufflier, and fuller. But also notice how much higher the skirt has become and this sort of cheeky way of photographing the ballerina from behind. We see its transference over into popular culture, much later in ways such as Hollywood's adaptation of the idea, the great Louise Brooks, who was a dancer before she became a film star, and perhaps more interestingly, Cléo de Merode. One of you had asked about the influence of fashion and ballet, and this may be one of the early key figures in Western Europe to do that. She was incredibly popular. Her face appeared on these postcards that were distributed all throughout Europe and the West, and she was one of the most recognizable women at that time period. Photographed in high fashion, theatrical costume, and even in ballet costumes, she was a ballet dancer, was really quite extraordinary. She was sort of, as a friend of mine said, the Kim Kardashian of her time period. But notice again, the date of this particular postcard, it's right around 1900. Look at how short that tutu is already becoming. In Russia, it was probably not the case of the costumes going quite that high. And my interest really is the role of the tutu, because again, as we're seeing it sort of fetishized a little bit, and certainly the tutu being worn by an array of international stars, the solidification of the tutu and its relationship in fashion, I argue, really starts during the interwar years. And one of the key ways we see this change is coming about is the bringing of real high classical Russian ballet to the West. And no ballet exemplified that perhaps more than the Sleeping Princess, as it was known. We think of it as the Sleeping Beauty. The 1921 production by Sergei Diaghilev of the full-length ballet was a real departure for him, not only because it was a full-length high classical ballet, normally he did one-act productions, but it brought a whole new range of costumes. These look pretty exotic, but they were less so than the ones that, as you saw earlier, Valerie had shown, the very sort of harem dancer. But notice also the trimming of the bodies. This is something Lynn had demonstrated over and over again. This more slender body type starts to come about as the rise in ballet changes. And keep in mind, I'll bring this subject back up in a minute, the idea of London as being an important epicenter. Not only do we see classical ballet, the concept of full-length Russian ballets becoming important, but the role of the Romantic style combining with it. And Pavlova was considered really a great archetype to bring back what Karsavina said was the Taglioni style of Romantic dancing, one that was expressive and also had a delicacy to it. And with that, of course, meant the return of the Romantic style tutu. We also have her sort of, if you will, twin almost, Olga Spetzieva, here in Giselle, her greatest role. But the Russian Ballet Russe, although they were doing productions like Scheherazade, were also interested in the Romantic revival. Two great pieces by Fokine, we have Les Sylphides, originally Chopignana, and Carnival, not only used music from the Romantic era, they really were carefully studying and looking at imagery to create the costumes from that time period. And perhaps it's not surprising that fashion had also gotten a bit of the Romantic bug. Now, what's interesting is we start to see skirts becoming fuller and sort of more ruffly during World War I, and by the 1920s, the alter ego, if you will, to the more slender, streamlined flapper-style dress, as it's called often, was this real romantic style. One of the great couturiers of the interwar years, Jean Lanvin, was probably the preeminent creator of the style garment. And although we recognize it less today, it was very prevalent and very important in its time period. But the interrelationship between ballet and fashion really galvanized around 1930. It's when the word ballettoman actually enters the Oxford English Dictionary. And part of this craze is thanks to the fact, sadly, that so many Russians were forced to leave, settling in two major centers at that time period. In Paris, very much so because you didn't need a visa to enter the country, and also London became another important city. Paris was important because in 1929, we know that Sergei Diaghilev died, and so the revival of the Ballet Russe would go and sort of manifest itself in many different ways. One of the important changes was that George Balanchine became one of its chief choreographers, and this particular piece, Le Cotillon, which has been discussed at length already today, was a very important piece where we saw the collaborative effects of a Russian choreographer, a Russian dancer, trained in Paris by a Russian ballerina. Here we have Tumanova, who was a student of Olga Preobrazhenskaya, another great Mariinsky dancer, wearing a costume by a French artist that was executed by a Russian designer. And again, Karinska is very important, but she really cut her teeth with dance costumes at this time period. And we do see this interrelationship, so that by the, I would say, 1933-34, many, many creators of fashion were doing their versions of the tulle evening dress. We see this over and over again. One of the most beautiful is this midnight blue version by Chanel, covered with sequin stars, not dissimilar from the one worn by Tumanova in the Cotillon costume. And even reaching into Hollywood. Hollywood was another important source for the dissemination of fashion concepts. Again, these were costumes, not fashion garments, but we can see the interrelationship during the mid to late 1930s. The other important thing is that fashion photography got into this, and many, many top photographers were again creating romantic imagery. In fact, the romantic style was permeating everything: interior design, contemporary fashion, as well as many areas of the performing arts. And what is interesting to me is, if you take a look at this Chanel dress and these two particular pieces by Madeleine Vionnet, it's so interesting that even they, the great modernists, these women who believed in highly functional and sleek clothes, really embraced the romantic trend as well. I particularly am interested in this ballerina skirt, as it was called, from 1924. It's sort of an early example and departure for Vionnet. But by the mid to late 1930s, she was doing quite a number of transparent garments or tulle-based garments for evening wear. Now, I want to point out one issue about Vionnet and where we see the technical interrelationship between ballet and fashion. Many of you know that Madeleine Vionnet was arguably the greatest couturier of the interwar years, and she became most famous for the manipulation and really the expansion of what one could do with the bias cut. But she almost always opted for very soft, pliable fabrics, silk satins or crepes, fabrics that had a sort of body-clinging quality but also were very easy to manipulate from that point of view. Karinska was aware of this, and she may have been the first ballet creator to have appropriated the bias, but instead of using the soft, flexible fabrics that the Vionnet used, she would actually do them for the more structured satins or velvets that were necessary for the corset tops of a ballerina's tutu. So by doing this, those of you that know construction, that the bias is pliable. So already she was giving greater flexibility and pliability to the costumes for choreographers like George Balanchine. But Karinska had a career on the other side of the channel as well, in what would become one of the most important ballet epicenters of the mid-century, London. As I noted, the British were great ballet fans. Ballet critics like Arnold Haskell and Cyril Beaumont arose. choreographers like Friedrich Ashton, who in fact was inspired by the dancing of Pavlova, ballerinas like Margot Fonteyn, and designers like Cecil Beaton all jumped onto the ballet bandwagon. And this romantic idea was exemplified not only in costume, in this particular piece, Apparitions, but also by fashion designers. Charles James, a milliner turned dressmaker, makes this beautiful piece. Also the coloration and use of materials, pink and black tulle, very evocative of ballet. Even more so is Norman Hartnell, one of the great British couturiers, this incredible piece that was done for a stage play starring Gertrude Lawrence, was only one of several types of romantic garments that he did inspired by ballet. And it's wonderful because he takes his cue not only from Chanel, whose lace dresses were probably a certain source of inspiration here, but note how he in fact makes the Queen Mum, one of the most regal and high-standing members of Western society, into a pseudo-ballerina, something that we certainly would not have expected in the Winterhalter portrait that we saw earlier of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. So this idea that ballet had transformed enough to take on a certain legitimacy was really this turning point in which ballet and fashion now became, if you will, sort of more directly interrelated. It is absolutely, I think, codified by the post-war era. As we see, this is the very young ballerina Margot Fonteyn, ready to go on tour with the Sadler-Wells Ballet. This company would eventually become the Royal Ballet. And she and a number of dancers from the company were in fact used as models to help promote British fashion. On their tour in 1949, which was highly, highly successful, they took America and Canada by storm. And Margot Fonteyn became a certified superstar. On the cover of Time magazine, she was also featured in the pages of Vogue. And the number of designers of the ISLFD, I always forget those initials, were very purposeful in using dancers who were the new ideal for high fashion. You had this sort of regal body type and this sort of slenderness that was absolutely in keeping with the 1950s style. Now what's interesting is how the garments start to take on a more rigid quality after the war. There's corseting, and certainly designers like Dior are responsible for leading that charge. And although Fonteyn, of course, is a loyal British citizen, she was a great lover of French fashion, and Dior was her favorite. She was very fortunate to have been introduced to Dior, and it's known that she did obtain a dress from his very first collection. Although more than 60 garments from her personal wardrobe exist in the Bath Museum in London, that particular dress has been lost. She also ordered her wedding dress from the house of Dior, and later from the house of Yves Saint Laurent. And she would, in the mid-1960s, be voted one of the 10 best-dressed women in the world. I think Fonteyn, like her predecessors, understood the importance of personification, the visual manifestation of the ballerina, both on stage and off. And Fonteyn, in many ways, was ideal because she had these so perfect ballet proportions. And I just want to point out not only her body type, which really has started to become our prototypical idea of the ideal dancer, but notice how the garments, the ballet costumes themselves are becoming much more rigid. This really is much more like that pancake or stiffened tutu. And we start to see the use of jewels now embroidered onto the front. If you see Margot Fonteyn in certain roles in the 1930s, her costumes are really much fluffier and they're covered with little bows and things, so that romantic vestige is somehow swept away for a style that's a little bit more streamlined. But still, the interrelationship between the romantic style of dress is certainly evident. Dior loved the ballet, as Valerie noted, and even created his famous black swan gown. But he was not the only one. Pierre Balmain also was a bit of a balletto man and attended the ballet. And one wonders whether or not this particular gown might have been inspired by Swan Lake. Now, Fonteyn was certainly not the only famous British ballerina, and arguably, according to some sources, Moira Shearer might have been the most famous ballerina at the mid-century, in large part due to her incredible role in The Red Shoes. The movie was made in 1948, and it was not only a great, probably the best ballet movie ever made, but one of the most popular films of the time. It didn't, however, get released in the United States till about 1950-51, so it continued to have, I think, legs for quite a while. I think one of the things that's so striking about that film is the high drama, the drama of the story, the drama of the performances on stage, and the clothing. It all goes hand to hand. And as one person had said, it's a hymn to excess. And I think also escapism, because remember that ballet grew and really became popular and really was interfacing with fashion very effectively during the Depression, World War II, and in the immediate post-war, Cold War era. And so this escapism and the sense of glamour may have helped contribute to the popularity of ballet around the world. And here we see just again, even Jacques Fath's work is featured here in Life magazine in America and really shows the interrelationship between dance and fashion. But on this side of the Atlantic, we do owe a great deal of credit to, again, the emigres coming out of Russia. Here we have the great George Balanchine, and as many have noted, the streamlined ballet style is what he's most famous for. But the idea of interfacing with dance, we have the great Tanaquil Leclerc wearing the original costumes designed by Korinska for La Valse. This is one of several what they call glove ballets, like Des Liebesliederwalzer was another one, where you have the full-skirted romantic style and the long evening gloves. In fact, it's very evocative of the type of garments one would have seen in the mid-century. And as Valerie noted, Christian Berard, who made the costume, designed the costume for Cotillon, inspired Dior, who inspired Korinska, who inspired Balanchine, who again probably saw this filtering process going back and forth. But we also see that other couturiers picked up on these ideas. Again, this layered tulle skirt. Two examples by Charles James, who I mentioned earlier, the British-American designer. We see this incredible piece, the butterfly gown, with layers of different colored tulle. Now again, certainly that dress is so rigid, nobody's going to do any ballet in it, but it certainly is sweeping and beautiful in motion. But his ready-to-wear version of it does give this essence of seeing the legs in motion and also the changing quality of the layers of tulle underneath. Now, while this may be a more sublime example of the interrelationship of ballet and fashion, we do have some rather funny ones. This has nothing to do with anything other than I found this particular image, and you'll see why in a second. This harkens back again to the work of Gilbert Adrian, who was the great Hollywood costumer. And many people credit Adrian with popularizing, if not actually starting certain trends. The dynamism of his costumes in MGM films during the 1930s was very important. And if you want to talk about hymn to excess, this certainly is it. Glinda the Good Witch in a ridiculous romanticized costume. And as she said, she looks like a fugitive from a German opera. I've always wondered, though, if you take a look at Cecil Beaton's work for the New York, believe it or not, this is New York City Ballet. Friedrich Aschen was invited to come and do a particular piece. So Tanaquil Leclerc, noted for her speed and long legs, exemplified in Balanchine's costume, looks a little bit like Glinda here. But one saw, I would say somewhat sadly, after the 1970s, a period I remember very fondly with ballet, a sort of falling off of popularity throughout the 80s and 90s with ballet. Even though its role in popularity may have changed a bit, one certainly sees that contemporary designers are picking up on this. Again, we know that from seeing them on the red carpet that many fashion designers look to these types of events to showcase their designs. And it's very obvious when you see this where the influence must have come from. But I think what's really touching is to see the interplay coming back into high fashion. As Mark Happel noted when he was making these costumes, the revival of Symphony in C, he was certainly looking at the work of the great Balenciaga, really here more for the structure, the sort of rigid mid-century structure of the bodice. And again, think back to those images of Margot Fonteyn in the Dior gown, as well as the ravishing embroidery done by Lesage for Christian Dior for his famous Juno gown, the Greek goddess whose symbol was the peacock. And again, all of this interrelating to Vogue's most recent layout. It's really wonderful to see the interest in ballet again and high fashion, especially in a center like Paris. But I think also, again, just on a personal note, it's always that sort of dream, the ethereal dream and the beauty. We know it's hard work. We know that ballet is something that requires tremendous natural gifts and discipline. And while most of us will never achieve it, this is probably the level at which we sort of actually go. We may aspire to something else. This is probably more like the reality. I think that being able to work in the field of fashion gives us incredible opportunities to see this interplay. And I'm really grateful to Valerie Steele and her vision of putting together these two great embodied art forms. Thank you very much. Any questions? Thank you.
I think Patricia stepped down too soon. You'll have to grab her afterwards for your questions. She disappeared before people could leap up. Now we're moving from ballet to modern dance. In fact, probably to the quintessence of original American modern dance, Martha Graham. So please join me in welcoming Janet Alber, former member of and now artistic director of the Martha Graham Dance Troupe, and Melissa Mara, associate curator of education and public programs at the museum, who will be in conversation about Martha Graham and her costumes. Thank you.
Well, Janet, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure.
And as Valerie mentioned, as artistic director of Martha Graham Dance Company and a former dancer during the years when Graham was collaborating with Halston, you definitely bring a unique perspective to the table today, so thank you. So Graham was a pioneer of American modern dance, and she was one of the 20th century's most important dancers. And I think part of what makes her so relevant in this conversation today about dance and fashion was her innovative her innovative costumes and the way she used them throughout her performances. So I thought we could start today by asking you to speak a little bit about the Graham technique and the role of costume.
Well, I think the essence of Graham's revolution actually is her approach, her new radical approach to the body and the use of gesture on stage, which then informs her costumes, of course. But the idea that she was struggling to find a way of moving that revealed the inner landscape, as she said, and she was stripping dance and movement down to the elemental, finally looking at primal gesture, at body language, studying how we reveal ourselves through movement, how we hold our bodies when we laugh or when we cry, and using those movements, those naturalistic movements, to inspire and motivate her new type of dance. So her technique, she discovered that emotion rides on the breath. When we laugh or when we cry, there's this impulse from the center of the torso. And she developed a dance technique driven by the torso, by her famous contraction and release. The contraction being the exhale and the coiling in of the torso, and the release being the inhale and the expansion of energy. And every movement in the Graham technique is motivated by the torso. So there are thousands of different types of contractions and releases. And they mean thousands of different things. Also important to her style, of course, was that it was the perfect marriage between the physicality and the emotional. So every move that you learn to do in the Graham vocabulary is married to an emotional image. The technique, she didn't develop the technique, sort of invent a vocabulary in the classroom and then go off and write poetry. She knew what she wanted to say on stage. She was developing work for the stage and then had to figure out how to teach other dancers to do it. So the technique was drawn out of the ballets that she was creating. And therefore, when you see a Martha Graham class, it's an emotional journey. It's a very fully motivated as well as physically powerful journey in a classroom exercise. Shall I go on to costumes?
Yes, and have costume, please.
Right. So she was anti-decorative. This stripping away of sort of superfluous gestures also applied to the way that she wanted to costume the body, to the music she chose. She danced on a bare stage. She didn't want a painted backdrop. And she was choosing a costume that would enhance and enrich the emotional message of her dance. And to that end, often needed to reveal the torso. I think we're going to have some examples at some point.
Yes.
Do you want to do that yet? But
We can.
do you want to do that?
Sure.
She, of course, was a student of the Dennis Shawn, of Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn. Oh, here we are in Lyman. There they are. Although she credits Miss Ruth and Ted for her great love and of fabric and her knowledge of fabric, she was really turning away from this idea that the fabric is a decoration. She told me that sometimes Miss Ruth would just get herself into a fabulous costume and have pictures taken, and then she would have to make up the dance afterwards, after she had created the poster. Where for Martha, it was quite the opposite. And in this stripping away, something like Lamentation, where a radical dance from 1930, the dancer is seated the whole time. We don't see her arms and legs. She's encased in this tube of stretched jersey, which just accentuates the torque, the wrench of pain in this Lamentation 4-minute dance from 1930, which kind of changed everything. And certainly speaks to the, sort of the essences of her costuming, that it was a part of the body and a part of this emotional expression she was going for.
The costume for Lamentation, this jersey too, and she sits in it and it expresses, it expresses this tension between the body and movement, was very radical in its time, wasn't it? How was it received?
Oh, Martha had one or two champions who kept her going. She tells a story about Lamentation, that a woman came backstage and had been crying, obviously had been crying, and said, "Miss Graham, you'll never know what you've done for me. I witnessed my son killed by a truck, and I haven't been able to cry until I saw Lamentation," and told me that grief had dignity. But the critics at the time were saying something like, "Well, when I see Martha Graham dance, I'm afraid she's going to give birth to a cube." Which, I always like to tell that joke after people see Lamentation.
I thought we could go through the defining characteristics of Graham's costuming. So here she is.
Primitive Mysteries from 1931. She was very inspired by the rituals of the American Southwest and made her own ritual. Hymn to the Virgin, this section is. The idea of revealing the torso, you can see that the chorus women basically have a leotard top, but the front of their skirt dips down almost to the pubic bone, so that the entire contraction that they are not showing you in this particular photo can be revealed. You can see the expression of the torso. And Graham's costume, so luminous and white against the sea of dark blue chorus members, and always reminds me of O'Keeffe paintings, flower petals. It's a very womanly costume, I think.
Well, and she had said also, I think I read in her autobiography, that the dress itself was inspired by a cactus blossom. So it wasn't, there's that flower reference. It's definitely there. One of my favorite costumes, Imperial Gesture.
Yes, and a beautiful reconstruction of this is in the exhibit. Imperial Gesture from 1935 was Graham's statement about the death of imperialism. And she became imperialism in this solo by for herself, and used the excess of fabric to talk about excess, and this skirt that she invented that actually drapes onto the floor several inches. It's not. It doesn't hit her ankle. Well, you can see it in some of these photos. So she could flourish it. It became a flag, banners. It became, of course, a cape and wings, and finally, she becomes so enveloped in it that she disappears. Very, many evocative images, and yet in Graham's abstract style, it would not have been sort of obvious flag waving or anything like that.
Appalachian Spring.
We chose this one because all of these things are really about the body. Martha had such a reverence for the body. She talked about the miracle of the small bones in our hands and our feet. And she often wanted costumes that revealed the torso, but also revealed the shape of the woman. If we were showing you the front of this Appalachian Spring bride, she's very much sort of a pillar. It's not an A-line full skirt in the front. But in order to accommodate the movement, she's got this gathered tail. And this occurs over and over again in Graham's costumes. And in fact, our dancers' rehearsal skirts are single pieces of fabric that are they just grab the fabric, bring it around to the back, and pin it together, and all the excess fabric goes to the back, so they've got this tail. In Appalachian Spring, the bride uses it to great effect to flirt with the husband and that sort of thing. In some of the other ballets, Eve in Embattled Garden and Lilith, Adam's first wife, it's a very sort of highly erotic comedy that Graham did. They're able to swish their tails, just the way you would swish your tail in a very animalistic and sexual way. So I think that's Martha would often just take a piece of fabric and drape it on you, pull things here, wrap things around. We have a beautiful dress of hers from Judith, which is bright red, and we've had an archivist looking at these lately, and she said, it had probably 8 darts on each side, seams on each side. It has a zipper, it's got a tail, it's very complicated. But this archivist said, this is one piece of fabric. And Martha had just wrapped it around her body and then pinned it the way she wanted it to fit her, and made it a fabulous costume.
Yes. Well, and I think it's also important to point out that she was very specific, wasn't she? Like, everything on that costume was there for a purpose. And I've read stories from former dancers of hers talking about, how she would make alterations just minutes before they were about to go on stage. And she was a perfectionist when it came to her costuming, wasn't she?
She was, because, and I believe it's because she, through the mentorship of Louis Horst, her musical director, he told her, look, don't choose music and then decorate it. Your physical, your choreography, your movement, your emotional theme should be the center of your dances. So commission music after you know what you're going to dance about. And it's the same thing I think is true of her work with Isamu Noguchi, and certainly her costumes. They were invented after she really got a hold of what she wanted to say physically, so that yes, the details, the specificity were there because she, like the choreography itself, she was constantly honing the detail to strip it down to its essences and to make it most powerful.
Great. So here we have Diversion of Angels.
This is a dance from 1948, and again, a design that she came back to over and over again. It's pants and a skirt. So the fabric wraps around the front leg, comes around the back, and then wraps around the other leg. It allows, again, the dancer to be standing still and to be a beautiful pillar of fabric. If you saw these dancers standing sideways, the skirt kind of cups under their bottoms so that the female figure is very much in evidence. And yet, when they do the fabulous off-balance work in this dance, you can see their legs, you can see the entire shape of their torso and their crotch, basically.
And I wanted to include a picture here of you from your days in the company. This is Seraphic Dialogue, and this is one of the costumes that Halston designed, isn't it?
Halston remade Martha's design for this ballet. He designed many original costumes for her, but in this one, this was Martha's design. Again, you can see that almost the entire torso is revealed. That roll at the top of the skirt comes up over the hip, but then really, again, down to the pubic bone. And very simple. It's red. It's a bright red dress with a deep purple, I don't know what you call this, but around the pelvis, it's got a purple edging. This ballet, Joan of Arc, is based on Joan of Arc. It has an incredible Noguchi set. And when the curtain goes up, it's like looking at a triptych of a stained glass window with 3 saints within the brass Noguchi set. And the simple graphics of the costumes are very church-like. They look like they could have come right out of the stained glass window. Full skirt in this one, it's not wrapped into a tail, but again, the entire torso is available for contractions and releases. You know, the wrap dress that's in Diversion of Angels, that pants and skirt, came back in several other ballets, notably Clytemnestra, where she not only allowed the legs to be seen wrapped in black jersey, but there was a beautiful panel on the inside of the skirt, so that when the Electra or Cassandra do kicks or open their legs somehow, they're this almost like on the side of a Greek vase in quite neon colors and black. Each queen had a different applique that represented their character between their legs.
One of her former dancers, Helen McGee, had written an essay, and she talks about Diversion of Angels and when they were working out this sort of tights in front, skirt at back costume. And she was really in awe of Martha when they were working through this, saying that she should have patented it, 'cause she was really, it was really her innovation. So I think that's remarkable.
She actually, with the Clytemnestra costumes, had she added to it to sort of sexualize those costumes even more. The fabric that wrapped around the legs and made the skirt was gathered at the hips, and at the base of our spines there was gathering that cupped the bottom, so that the sexuality of the women in Clytemnestra is emphasized.
It draws your focus there. So I thought we can talk a little bit about the relationship, the friendship between Martha Graham and Halston, because it really was seems like it was a very special, unique friendship that they had.
Halston came on the scene in the 70s when I was dancing with the company, and he and Martha just fell in love with each other, I have to say. I mean, he was such a gentleman and took such great care of her and would send cars for her and dress her, of course, make not only when she went off to a wonderful gala, but her rehearsal wear. He made her simple silk pants and a tunic that she would wear. So he really took wonderful care of her. And along with the costume collaboration, which we can talk more about, I think he saved her in a way. He came into her life just as she was having to accept the fact in her late 70s that she would never be on stage again. And she found, with his help, she became sort of part of this new celebrity culture. in America. People magazine came into being, and she did a Black Glamour ad, What Becomes a Legend Most, and Halston would take her to Studio 54 with Truman Capote, and of course Betty Ford, who had danced with her as a young woman, was in the studio quite often. Jackie O would come to visit, Alexander Calder, and she was able to, with his help and glamour, because she couldn't have afforded it otherwise, she was able to be a glamorous celebrity, and I think it allowed her to continue to create for another 20 years.
Well, and, you know, they both understood fabric. They both valued the integrity of materials. And, you know, from all the research that I've done, it seems like they really met on this plane, and they both admired one another. You know, I'll fast forward a little bit in the slides. This was one of the images that Valerie showed this morning. This is one of those original costumes that Halston designed for one of Graham's ballets from Tangled Night.
Right, and you can see what they've done here is reverse the tail skirt so that the tail is in the front of this, also liberating the dancer's legs. Graham, Noguchi, Halston, they were fascinated with snakes. I did the ballet Lucifer with Halston and had a snake headdress and a snake prop that I used and that sort of thing. But Martha would, as she did with all of us when she began a new ballet, I like to think she kind of hypnotized us. She would bring in beautiful art books and show us images. She would often bring in poetry, and mostly I remember the art that she would bring. And at a certain point, we'd all be warmed up and want to say, okay, just tell us how you want our legs to go. But she wanted to talk, and she wanted to get inside of a world. And as I gained a little maturity, I realized that she did it with Noguchi, and she did it with Halston. She was getting us all invested and helping us all enter her world. And then she was smart enough to sort of send us off and say, see what you can do. She would assign Peter Sparling and I to go and improvise and play with a duet that we would bring back to her, and she would shape it and make it harder, usually, and that sort of thing. And Isamu Noguchi would come back with a mock-up of a set, and Halston would come back with sketches. And she was almost always delighted. She really... Isamu said, when Martha says, let me think about it, he knew that she didn't like it. But she was a great collaborator, and I think created an atmosphere where there was mutual respect, and it allowed the creativity to flow. So as you can see, Halston discovered her love of the body, this nude unitard underneath the skirt, and the sexuality of the snake images and that tail that wraps around to the front.
And do you know how their collaborative process went? I mean, I know that that you guys would come in and perform for Halston, right, and do a run-through of the dance in front of him, and then he would do some sketches. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, he would visit quite often, and as I say, he was often part of the early discussion of just what was going to happen. But he would come in and often bring fabric, and Martha would ooh and ah and just drool over the quality of the fabric that he could bring. And I think they often would actually, she'd go over to his showroom, and they'd just sort of lay out these wonderful things for her to look at and choose from. And then he would go back to, she would say yes, no, and they'd look over the sketches and that sort of thing, and he would go back to his studio, and we would go there for costume fittings quite often. It was always a great luxury to go into his studio. Martha, by that time, was quite arthritic. Her hands kind of went sideways, but she would still try to grab a pinch of fabric. She couldn't quite describe what she wanted, and Halston would be right there, and his minions would be right there with pins and the wherewithal to kind of allow her to play and fix it and get those details that she no longer could do herself.
Well, and Halston had said in an interview that, he was talking about how much he admired Martha Graham, and he would say, that she never wanted to inhibit his creativity. And he would say, but I'm constantly looking to her for inspiration. She knows so much. I have her counsel here. And she didn't want to kind of touch that. She gave him a lot of freedom, which was really interesting considering how important the costumes were to her. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Halston, I do remember Halston asking us, he was doing a bathing suit line, and he had several of us show us. At that time, we were wearing leotards outside of our tights, very unchic these days, but we would roll up the edge of the leotard as high as we could to make our legs look longer. Mm-hmm. And Pat Cleveland was there, one of his models, in one of his new swimsuits, and he had a couple of us show us how high we would roll our leotard, what line we liked best, and had his minions working that for his swimsuit line.
There they are. Yes, Halston and his Halstonettes. One of the, I think it was Agnes de Mille, and she wrote that Halston had really altered the entire pictorial aspect of Graham's ballets, that his thumb mark was on every ballet. And I think that's really, again, as I was saying before, a testament to how much she trusted him, how they influenced one another. And I think Halston, too, was really inspired by Graham's world of dance. And this image speaks to that, certainly. In 1977, he did a collection where he did all these bodysuits. He did them in cashmere and wool and silk. And he boasted that they gave the body absolute freedom. But again, it's inspired by that world. And there's Pat Cleveland in the red bodysuit in the front. He called them body sweaters, and he called that color hothouse red. And just looking at another way that, Halston was inspired by Graham's world. Here's from that same year, one of those body sweaters that he paired with an ultra suede overskirt. And it really bears a striking resemblance to Graham's costume from Imperial Jester. So this was that Black Glamour ad that you were referring to before that she starred in with Rudolf Nureyev and Margot Fontaine. And I guess, you made this point about, her relationship with Halston gave her this, the fact that he was doing these costumes for her gave her this life after she could no longer perform. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit more about her relationship to the culture of celebrity at the time, because she's really celebrated as an icon at that time.
Yeah, I think she had lived long enough that people began to have a perspective on what she had actually done in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And since she was no longer on the stage and still dancing or trying to dance and create new works, there was a real appreciation for that earlier era. And she stepped right into it. I mean, Martha Graham was a woman of the theater. She was, because she was able to read people's body language so well, because that's what she had based her entire artistry on, she was very facile at, as a director, she just knew exactly how to push your buttons as a dancer. But she'd sit down at a gala and walk away with a $50,000 check from somebody she was sitting next to. She had that kind of interaction. I was lucky enough to dance at the White House. Part of this added celebrity of the 70s was that Betty Ford was in the White House and had danced with Martha. And it was, of course, a grand evening with red carpet and flags, and we were riding back to the hotel after the event, and she was snuggled down in her fur coat. And she said, you know, as I walked down that red carpet and looked at all those uniforms and those flags, all I could think of was, oh, if only my mother could see me now. It was sort of surprisingly human for Martha to say something like that I'm sure we've all felt in one way or another.
Well, she's lucky to have been an artist who was there, who was still alive while she was being celebrated as an icon. It doesn't always happen. So now, you know, Graham is certainly an icon today, and she's someone who has inspired fashion designers, stylists, artists. So the next couple slides I'm going to flip through. Just look at some of the ways she's inspired fashion. This is an editorial from Harper's Bazaar, 1994, and it accompanied an article that Madonna wrote about her friendship with Martha Graham. But here, you know, she's evoking this sort of fabric coming to life that I think we associate with Graham. This is Marc Jacobs' Spring 2010 collection. And the collection itself was inspired by dance and theater, but the makeup specifically, Graham was the reference for it. So the buns on the head and the very dramatic pale face with the red lips. And I think in these two instances also, the dresses actually do have a very modern dance feel. They kind of remind me of that Letter to the World dress we first saw. More recently, spring 2015, this is Tracy Reese's collection, and here she cited Martha Graham as the inspiration for the entire collection, and it really went beyond just referencing these dance-inspired looks. She looked into the life of Martha Graham, and some of the clothes had these Southwest vibe to it, these prints of plants, which had influenced Martha Graham a lot throughout her career. And lastly, this beautiful ad from Vionnet from spring 2014, where literally the model is recalling that Graham Letter to the World pose that was in the first slide. And once again, this idea of clothes that bring fabric to life. So I thought maybe, Janet, could you speak a little bit to the legacy of Martha Graham today? Why you think she's such an inspiration, and maybe even how you work to keep that legacy alive as artistic director of the company now.
I think the idea that Martha got a hold of, this idea of stripping down to essences, is something that makes her inspiring, that so many people have been able to take Graham shapes, the use of fabric, because again, they were sort of elemental and primal and therefore malleable. They could inspire many different things, like Madonna is doing a faux lamentation, or this sweep of fabric. So I think that's a big part of, I mean, for me as artistic director, this is certainly what makes the legacy exciting and valuable. It is a springboard for so much new creativity. So one of our favorite examples is that in 2007, we had an opening night here in New York City on the anniversary of 9/11, and we wanted to commemorate it somehow, but we didn't have much time or money, and we asked 3 young choreographers to take a look at a film we have of Martha Graham dancing Lamentation. And we said, it'll be a one-night only event. Please just spew out a choreographic reaction to Graham's Lamentation in your own style, your own voice. You can only have 10 hours of rehearsal. You have to use public domain music or silence. You can use any number of dancers in the company. Keep it under 4 minutes, because that's how long Lamentation is. Simple costumes that are kind of purple and burgundy and black and flesh-colored like Lamentation. You know, we made up a bunch of rules just to make it all happen quickly. And we got 3 beautiful gems of contemporary choreography organically tied to who we are and what we do, immediately programmed them for the rest of our season and started touring them around the world and commissioning new lamentation variations. We are up to 8. The originals were by Larry Kegwin, Richard Move, Azure Barton. We have Lar Lubavitch, we have Yvonne Rayner, we have Doug Verone. And Lamentation will be 85 in 2015. We've commissioned 4 new Lamentation variations by Michelle Dorrance, who's one of the most fabulous tap dancers right now. Kyle Abraham just won the MacArthur Grant. Liz Garing comes out of the Merce Cunningham family tree. And Sonia Tea is in our studio this week. She is one of the choreographers on So You Think You Can Dance. So an incredibly eclectic group of artists who are all creating works inspired by this, seminal solo of Martha Graham. And that's the tip of the iceberg, it's really... And again, I think because she got down to the essences, you can really mess with it in a whole variety of ways.
Actually, I was just sitting here, I was just wondering, do you ever, considering that Martha had such a respect for materials and, in the 30s, she was experimenting with, elasticized synthetics and jerseys, do your costume designers for your new pieces now, are they encouraged to go explore innovations in textile technology and things like that?
Yes, we commission new works and we're very open to, we had a fashion designer, a Greek fashion designer, Tassos, create the costumes for Echo, work we commissioned there's Echo. Some Grecian pleats, it's based on a Greek myth, this choreography. But as you can see, it reveals the body beautifully. And we also, as we reconstruct some of Graham's costumes, we're not slavish about finding the original fabric. Martha was practical, and we have to be practical. We look for fabric that will mimic what the original did, but is washable and practical for touring and that sort of thing. But it's a big job. We had a lot of our costumes damaged by Hurricane Sandy. They were all down in our basement. So we're in a long, probably 4 to 5 year process. We had over 5,000 costumes underwater for 2 weeks. So it's a long process of replacing, and it's careful consideration to make sure that they do have the impact that Graham intended them to, that they still serve the emotional message of her works. And yet, we can take advantage of today's, technology and new fabrics.
Well, and I'll just end with this, since you mentioned Echo. When I saw the performance last spring, I saw this costume, and since we've been talking today, the whole day has been about this sort of mutual relationship between fashion and dance. When I saw this costume, I immediately thought of this Madame Grey photograph. So just some food for thought, we can leave it at that, but you wonder if maybe the designer who was a fashion designer was looking at something like this or thinking about, the work of Madame Grey or something like that. So Janet, thank you so much. So I guess we'll open it up to any questions, if anybody has any questions. Yes.
I have a question, Janet. I wonder, how do you find and commission costume designers or fashion designers to do your costumes?
We commission the choreographer. It's the artist who then chooses their designer. And I don't believe we've had anyone yet ask us, who do you think I should use? Usually the choreographers have someone very much in mind that they'd like to use.
I have one question here.
Yes, you spoke earlier about the collaboration between Graham and Halston. And specifically, you spoke at one point about Halston's swimwear and how he was using the dancers and their leotards to talk about it. Back in the day, my husband was actually the the designer for the swimwear company that made Halston swimwear. And one thing that I remember about his swimwear that actually came out of some of his gowns, and it was true in the cover-ups they made for the swimwear also, was that the pieces were cut out of one piece generally on the bias, and they had a single seam that kind of came from like under the bust line and wrapped around the body. I was wondering whether those ever showed up in Graham and whether the collaboration came from there by any chance.
You know, I don't remember if those showed up, but I do remember, you know, that they would have conversations about the bias of the material, and you know, when Halston was first working with us, they would bring in fabric, and Martha kept turning it. She kept, you know, trying to get it in the right direction. So I think there was probably a lot of conversation about it. I don't remember any one-seamed costumes.
Hi. Do you have that picture of the red, the model in the red leotard and all the dancers?
Yes.
Which one were you in there?
Those were Halston's models.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't in that one.
Okay.
No.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please come back tomorrow at 10, and we'll start for another fabulous day.